The substance was horribly unforgettable and shines a glaring white light at the gross effects of society's indisputable rejection of aging women, making it feel impossible and violent for women to age. When I was 13, my mom told me to put on anti-aging eye cream. Like me, women across the globe were taught to dread the inevitable increase in a number that we hold so tightly to our identities as we revolve around the sun: our age. The obvious feminist ideas in response to society are clear. The perceived and relational value of a woman declines as her age increases. You're treated better when you're young and sexy. You're given sexual attention, or the ability to sexualize you is gone once you've aged. Success, favor toward, and attention to aging women decline. There's a raging war inside every woman to be attractive. And plastic surgery is coveted and normalized now because of you. It's done. My life is over. I'm going to be erased from society. Coralie Fargeat's newest horror, The Substance, explores the psyche of Demi Moore's Elisabeth Sparkle, an aging Hollywood starlet. On her way out of the limelight as an aging woman in society, Sparkle takes a black market drug to give birth to her younger self, Sue, played by Margaret Qualley, and the two continue the cycle of hatred towards oneself to a gruesome end. This movie reminded me of Carrie, The Shining, and Black Swan. The Substance's branding reminds me of Spoiled Child in more ways than one. I also don't want to go into the shrimp scene that everyone's been obsessed with because I think it's seriously minor compared to the rest of the film. I can go into these points in another video, but I'd like to focus on what The Substance ambitiously communicates to us in its form. Form is the overall system of relationships between the elements of the film, including its narrative structure, sound, performance, and visual elements. The Substance visually represents the psychological torment Elisabeth experiences with physical elements. We're able to understand quite quickly that the Hollywood star of Elisabeth's name is the physical embodiment of an aging starlet. Having Elisabeth host a workout segment on TV to also allude to the fact that audiences such as we participate in this torment in its format. She passes by posters of her younger self over the years every day and has her most recent self framed largely in her home. When her billboard is torn down and replaced with Sue, her younger self, she is forced to look at Sue outside of her living room, so satirically, so largely and loudly. These physical manifestations of herself looking at herself from afar or through a screen metaphorically represents Elisabeth and Sue's obsession over her perception, her outward appearance in the world and with herself, unattached from herself, something to maintain and protect. It's relatable. The only way she knows or acknowledges her existence is through the mirror or photographs. The way she understands her worth and value or desirability is through the validation or love from the people around her that communicate that to her externally. And while she disappears for 7 days at a time, we learn that she doesn't have anybody left or looking for her, which leaves the unfortunate few she relies on to provide her that affection: the audience, the network, people, and her fans. I think this leads into her denial that Sue and her are one. When Sue borrows more spinal fluid to continue being Sue for another hour, it causes Elisabeth's finger to decay. She dehumanizes and villainizes Sue as her and she, furiously phoning the Substance people to see if she can reverse it, again masterfully mimicking the urgency and importance aging women place on signs of aging, looking for a solution to reverse them or delay them. The person behind the Substance offers Elisabeth to kill the switch and stop the experience, and she declines when she realizes she will be fully alone as Elisabeth. This is when we are communicated the true fear of her character, her aloneness, reminded that they are one. Elisabeth doesn't have a solution better than to look forward to living fully as Sue and spend her days alone as Elisabeth. She doesn't accept that they are one, nor can she fathom it. Over the switches, we see the two women grow increasingly enraged and disgusted by one another, hiding and cleaning up after the other, refusing to reconcile their similarities in destructive, self-loathing, impulsive behavior. The true way of reflection, or looking directly at oneself, is an opportunity so provided by the Substance's experience, but Elisabeth declines, both as herself and Sue, choosing to replace responsibility on the other and never upon herself. This is where the Substance's reliance on the physical products or manifestations of Elisabeth's psyche really shines. As Elisabeth spends her days alone, she's really fully and entirely spending herself with frustration and inaction. In a frenzied rage in response to Sue's post-party mess, she turns her home into a war zone of debauchery in another way. Cooking a French feast in its most bacchanal, an overindulgence of guilt quite personified by the sheer and unrealistic volume of food she's made for herself. She covers her living room window so to hide Sue from herself, billboard Sue, quite literally representing her readiness to hide away from everyone, including herself. It felt like she was doing this to retaliate against Sue, herself, but it was her honest outcry to herself, Sue, of the real disgust and peril her mind was in. This sequence was personally my favorite, and the living room set design was so loud and so disturbing that I wish they had spent more seconds of screen time letting the audience bask in it. Of course, that wouldn't have served to represent Sue's psyche when she sees the mess that Elisabeth's made. Quickly, she cleans it all up and decides to farm as much fluid as possible from Elisabeth's back, so she wouldn't have to become her again. Looking back at the diner moment when the aged version of the nurse that recommended the substance to Elisabeth asked her ominously if she started eating away at Elisabeth yet. It implies that this is a shared experience, the irreconcilability of oneself on the substance, and the greed of time. As an aside, the picture of a party girl that has to clean up after and remove and hide away the older woman, and the older woman that has to clean up after the party girl and spends her days alone, I feel is a direct nod to the way mothers struggle with the passage of time as their daughters grow up. A shared and mutual resentment exists as one is disgusted by another, and both live entirely separate and juxtaposed lives. It's a not-so-funny joke that mothers live through their daughters and their second lives as a desired, important women is at risk of ending once they give everything they are to motherhood. We understand where Elisabeth is coming from, and we might see a family member this year reminds us of someone we may have left behind or forgot to check in on, or someone who feels disposed and unloved. But of course, we get to meet Elisabeth's struggle with never-enoughness in its most physical and literal through Fred. Fred's purpose as a flat character offers Elisabeth's character a chance to change the course of her life, a chance to believe she is enough. She can do this by reconciling that she needs to work against the hate that she has for herself and allow herself to be loved past the surface. The history that is exposed through dialogue, that he's thought of her as the most beautiful girl in the world even in childhood, is the only piece of information we get to learn about pre-famous Elisabeth. Everything else we learn about her we see unfold during the film. Fred gives Elisabeth his phone number, which to our surprise she accepts, and even calls to schedule a date after the first botched switch. We see her looking absolutely gorgeous for the date before doubting it entirely when she exchanges glances with Billboard Sue and herself in the mirror. She puts on more makeup, hides her chest, and turns back around from leaving her home to physically smudge and hurt her face with such irritation and pain, pulling and damaging her skin. They actually took 11 takes of this smudging sequence before the makeup artist told them to stop, because it would physically hurt Demi Moore's facial skin. Elisabeth doesn't think she's good enough to leave the house, to be on a date, to be desirable. This is when the fork in the roads the film could take seriously diverges its paths. Elisabeth isn't going to have a happy ending where she turns her outlook around. Elisabeth can't. That would be too hopeful. And ironically, although there are many unrealistic elements of the world in the substance, it would be even more unrealistic for Elisabeth to end the war in herself, just like that. Dare I say, even a disservice, if what it took for her to heal and turn the page is to let a man love her. This is what I think would have been the real misogyny many critics are arguing this movie has. I disagree. Coralie Fargeat believes that the only way to communicate this cruel experience that so many women feel is visually, physically, and literally. She explains, "The violence in the movie is really a way to take out all the violence I felt within me. I felt the need to express all this regarding how you are seen and what your body looks like." And to touch on the topic of the incredibly violent and long sequence of Sue murdering Elisabeth, she chooses to reject herself for the last time, choosing to reject her oneness, her ugly parts, and her flaws. Her character's weakness is what ultimately ends her. Although there's no literal antagonist, she herself becomes a victim of her own flaws. Most notably, and I've hardly seen anyone highlight what Fargeat continues with, this quote, "I really wanted to express that when you're a woman, your body is everything but neutral in the public space. It's constantly scrutinized, judged, analyzed, fantasized, sexualized. Then you can't ignore it. It also defines how we are allowed to invest in the world. It's a super powerful jail that prevents us from taking up space. That inequality is so internalized, and the weapons that are internalized are the strongest ones. It was important for me to show that reality that is still a taboo to speak about, putting it outside with this amount of guts, blood, and violence and say, look at this." I found the white tile bathroom and the end scene, which I'll say more about in a second, to be the most visually relevant manifestations of Fargeat's intentions. The white tile bathroom is universally popular in the real world, including mine, and timeless, making this familiar for audiences everywhere. Both medical and relatable in its most vulnerable and harsh light, Elisabeth and Sue get to see themselves be reborn over and over again in that bathroom. It serves as a sterile backdrop to sexualize and criticize Elisabeth and Sue in an exaggerated, glaring contrast. much like the exaggerated glaring insecurity that is imparted to them when they look in the mirror. It goes to show without saying that when Sue builds a dark back room in the bathroom, she literally locks her true self, Elisabeth, away. It's a rejection of the real world in its dark surrealism, but we are able to empathize, in many ways, the vulnerabilities and insecurities we have in secret. I also saw this as a nod to plastic surgery, as many go under the knife to be reborn as a new person, but just enough that they won't be found out as obviously undergone plastic surgery. And with many high-visibility celebrities, it's like a secret. And finally, in its most violent and uncomfortable, monster Elisa Sue on stage. Only when she is devoid of her own body, a quarter of herself, and is technically dead, is she ready to leave her home as herself. Pacing the face of Elisabeth to unrealistically make her way onto the stage, monster Elisa Sue embodies what I believe to be Fargeat's visual representation of the only way and body you could be in society that would be truly your own in all its flaws that you feel. A body so unrecognizable and horrifying will society be unable to take more from you, sexualize or criticize you. Of course, society rejects and attacks Elisabeth as she holds her own, finally comfortable being seen. And in this gory Carrie King Kong sequence, do we feel seen? Visually representing that, despite our never-enoughness to ourselves, the never-enoughness will be irrelevant and fruitless anyway in the eyes of society. This long, drawn-out, violent sequence that, albeit could have used a trigger warning, made us sit with the discomfort of its truth. Empathizing with Elisabeth or monster Elisa Sue isn't the goal of the sequence. In fact, I haven't felt so nauseous in a film I almost decided to leave. This, however, made me draw a connection from this scene to the one that may have seemed harmless entirely, undetectable. This bloody monster sequence felt just as nauseating as the glorifying workout sequence we watched when Sue performs her show for the first time, with exaggerated, awkwardly gross, over-sexual close-ups of Coralie's body and the cast and crew. Other than it quite accurately depicting what it feels like to be a woman that has to swallow this young and sexy propaganda every day, it violently tells us that we as a society have failed every single Sue and every single Elisabeth in our lives. In a way, I felt that the film took its opportunity to punish us gruesomely and cruelly because we participate in this war, both continuously in our lives and during the aforementioned workout sequence, to name a few, because we were criticizing and sexualizing and watching closely. To meta-theatrically use a 15-minute grueling sequence as a moment for the audience to reflect and sit with this uncomfortable reality that we are the reasons for this infinite cycle, as participants, as watchers, as critics of other women and ourselves. So what are my final thoughts? I hated the substance. At first. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I would see monster Elisa Sue in my dreams and in the mirror. I felt alienated in the shower where I am arguably at my most vulnerable, and not to say that that's the point. It needed to be violent. It's a verified cult classic. But instead, and specifically, it made me acknowledge the depth to which I am a participant. As a woman, as a watcher, as a critic. Even before watching the movie itself, the marketing copy invites you to participate. Have you ever dreamt of being a better version of yourself? You have to change every 7 days. Would you make the switch? It's that tempting question that has also become somewhat of a normalized conversation starter, in some places between you and your friends. If you could change one thing about yourself, what would you change? If you could go under the knife for one thing, what would you do? There's a seductive invitation to try something once it's made known to you, like plastic surgery, and like the substance as soon as Elisabeth finds out about it. It feels tempting and seductive because there's a dirty truth behind that feeling. If you could reverse time or change something about yourself, you would. Also, not to be a hater, but the fact that the shrimp scene is the most obvious and tiny point of imagery for society is being the most analyzed on the internet right now is crazy. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about the substance, and if you're curious about any other topics you'd like me to explore. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.